Welcome to the LGBTIQ plus Health Australia Policy and Research webinar. Today, we're going to be exploring some extraordinary systems changes in Tasmania. In recent years, Tasmania has become a leader in LGBTIQ plus equality and policy making. It's a significant improvement from being the worst Australian jurisdiction just a few years ago. My name is James Zanotto. I'm the Policy, Research and Communications Director at LGBTIQ Health Australia, and my pronouns are he, him. LHA acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, their diversities, their histories and their knowledge, and their continuing connection to land and community. We pay our respects to all First Nations people and to elders of past, present and future generations. Please feel free to use the chat function to acknowledge the traditional custodians where you are today. Now, before I begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. Again, our webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the LHA website. If you miss any information, you'll be able to find it there and go back and listen. After our presentations, there'll be an opportunity for some questions. So I invite you to use the Q&A function on your Zoom chat. It's at the bottom of the screen for most Zoom users. And if anything in today's webinar raises concerns for you, support is available. You can contact QLife, which provides Australia-wide anonymous support for LGBTIQ plus community members. QLife services are free and include both telephone and web chat support. Call 1-800-184-527 or visit qlife.org.au. So now, into the business. Today, Rodney, Croome and Lynn Jarvis will jointly present from their experience and perspectives of LGBTIQ plus policy reform in Tasmania. Rodney is a long-term advocate for the LGBTIQA plus community in Tasmania and nationally. He fronted the successful campaign to decriminalise homosexuality in Tasmania and was the National Director of the Australian Marriage Equality. He also worked on anti-discrimination protections, parenting equality, transgender recognition, and lifting the gay blood ban. Rodney helped establish Tasmania's 5 LGBTIQA plus government reference groups and is the chair of 2 of them. For his work, Rodney was made a member of the Order of Australia in 2003 and named Tasmanian of the Year in 2015. Dr. Lynn Jarvis is the Chief Executive Officer for Working It Out, Tasmania's only dedicated service provider for Tasmanian LGBTQIA plus communities. Lynn's worked in a variety of management and executive level positions across government, adult and higher education, mental health and not-for-profit sectors. While born and bred in Tasmania, Lynn has also lived and worked in Japan, Malaysia and Cambodia. A key theme of Lynn's work is supporting those marginalised from opportunity to live a full and inclusive life in whatever way that means for them. She has a BA Honours from the University of Tasmania, a Bachelor of Education from Edith Cowan University, and a Doctorate in Education from the University of Wollongong. On those notes, very much welcome Lynn and Rodney, and I'd like to pass across to Rodney, who will begin our presentation today.
Thanks, James, and hello, everyone. I guess before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all on, including the lands Lynn and I are on, the Palawa and Pakana people in Lutruwita, Tasmania, and also, of course, acknowledge LGBTIQA plus elders and leaders, past, present and emerging. As you indicated, James, there's been a substantial shift in laws and policies and attitudes in Tasmania over the last 10, 20 years. It was only in 1997 that Tasmania decriminalised sex between men. It was the last state in Australia to do that. Before that, we had the highest maximum penalty of anywhere in the Western world, 21 years in jail. And that law had been enforced up until the 1980s. So it still has a legacy that we live with. And it also wasn't until 2000 that we decriminalised cross-dressing. Tasmania was the only state to criminalise men dressing in items of women's clothing between sunset and sunrise, which sounds a bit silly to us today. But of course, that law was enforced and had its most dramatic impact on trans women. Since that law reform in the late 90s and early 2000s, Tasmania has changed dramatically. Our laws in particular. Not long after decriminalisation, Tasmania enacted an Anti-Discrimination Act, which was and remains one of the most progressive in the nation for LGBTIQA plus people. There were never any exemptions, for example, for faith-based organisations. So LGBTIQA plus students and staff and clients, faith-based schools and services have been protected from discrimination for the last 26 years. That law also provided very strong protections from hate speech and from bullying conduct. Again, some of the strongest in the nation, if not the strongest. We were also one of the first states to enact, to recognise same-sex relationships in the law, and to enact, or the first state actually, to enact a civil partnership scheme back in 2004. The first state to recognise overseas same-sex marriages and to introduce a state same-sex marriage law and to have Parliament agree to the principle of marriage equality. And more recently, of course, Tasmania has enacted some of the most progressive gender recognition and discrimination laws, not only in Australia, but in the world. There's no medical gatekeeping for trans and gender diverse people who seek to change their identity documents. They can do that entirely of their own will. And there's even a capacity in Tasmania to take gender off birth certificates if you wish not to be defined by that in your identity documents, which is something that hasn't really been enacted elsewhere. Now, I don't want to give the impression that everything's fantastic, of course, in the law reform area. We still don't have a ban on conversion practices. The state government, the Liberal government, introduced some legislation at the end of last year, which was shoddy, to say the best, and we're working to try and improve that. We also still don't have a ban on medically unnecessary cosmetic surgeries on infants who have variations of sex characteristics. And of course, we look to the ACT for leadership on that. But there are some other issues that we are pioneering in Tasmania at the moment, particularly the issue of redress. So we're pushing for redress for those who were convicted and charged under the old laws that I mentioned earlier. We're pushing for redress for those who have survived conversion practices, and for redress for those people who had those unnecessary cosmetic surgeries when they were smaller because of to normalise their sex characteristics. So that's an issue in Tasmania at the moment. We're pushing to try and get redress so that the state takes, and society in general, takes greater responsibility for the harms that have been inflicted on LGBTIQA plus people in the past. All that law reform, of course, is important in itself, but it also reflects a change in attitudes. When we first started campaigning to decriminalise homosexuality in the late 80s, support for that reform was 15% below the national average. When we all voted in the marriage equality postal survey in 2017, support for that reform in Tasmania was above the national average. And really amongst the states only second to Victoria. So there's been a big change in Tasmania, a transformational shift, not only in the legal situation for LGBTIQA plus people, but in community attitudes as well. Again, I don't want to suggest that things are perfect, but it's far from it. But we should all take heart from the changes we've seen in Tasmania, and certainly I and Lynn and others are very proud of it. Lynn, would you like to have a bit of a chat about some of the changes in our relationship with the government?
Thanks, Rodney. As I think James mentioned at the start there, Tasmania has a number of LGBTIQA plus reference groups. And some of these have been around for a long time, and some of them stem from a lot of the work that Rodney and others did around the decriminalisation of homosexuality in the late 20th century. So the Department of Education has a working group which has now been going for 27 years. The Department of Health has a reference group which has been going for 25 years. The Department of Police, Fire and Emergency Services has a group that has been going for 24 years. There is a whole of government group that looks after a lot of the other group agencies and government departments that don't have their own group. And the most recent group to emerge is the Department of Justice group, which has been around for about 4 years. So the longevity of those groups is something that's really important, and the deep work that they can do over that time. A really second and important factor that I think is, I don't know if it's unique to Tasmania, but I think it doesn't always apply across other reference groups, because reference groups in themselves are not a unique phenomenon to Tasmania. But one of the important things is that these are departmental reference groups and not ministerial reference groups. And they are generally chaired by the secretary of the department. So the department or agency head, for example, the Commissioner of Police chairs the Police, Fire and Emergency Services group, the Secretary for Health chairs the Department of Health group, and so on. So that means that we have very high level engagement from departments in these groups, but we are not sort of at the whim of different ministers who might come and go and decide that the group's not going to happen or is going to happen. So we are able to have continuity of the groups because they sit in departments, not particularly with ministers. Ministers do attend, and depends a bit on their interest in this space. Sometimes we get some very engaged ministers that like to attend all or part of those reference group meetings. And sometimes we have ministers that are not all that engaged, and so they may not turn up, but they've always invited. We regularly see the Premier at the whole of government reference group, and the Minister for Community is a good supporter in the in that group as well. So yes, we do have engagement from ministers, but it's not dependent on that engagement from ministers. And indeed have continued under unsupportive ministers. So where we've had ministers that are not supportive of the LGBTIQA plus community, we have been able to keep those groups going and allowed them to keep doing the work that they're doing. So I think that's slight removal from that political nature of some of these groups has been really important in creating long-term relationships and engagement with government, particularly at the higher levels. Some of the people that attend those groups are regularly heads of different sections of those departments or deputy secretaries. So it allows us to create relationships there and to really have time to talk about issues that might be impacting the LGBTIQA plus community. In addition, all of those groups have community members, so people selected from the LGBTIQA plus community who are interested in government and policy and research and who feel that they would like to contribute to those groups. You know, it can be challenging to make sure that all the voices, different voices from the community get represented, and that's an ongoing challenge, I think, for all of us. I think the other feature of those groups is that they all but one of those groups have a community co-chair. So, for example, I'm the co-chair of the whole of government reference group. Rodney is the co-chair of the Department of Justice group and just acting as a co-chair of the Department of the Education working group at the moment. So what that role does is allows us to gather information from other community members and to bring up agenda items and to have some say in how the groups are run and some sense of agency, I guess, in how those groups operate. So sometimes without that community co-chair, sometimes the group can become a we'll tell you what we're doing kind of experience, but by having a community co-chair, we can make sure that issues that are important to community are put on the agenda and can be discussed by community members. And we can invite other people in to present to those groups, and we often do. When we hear of new research, for example, we will usually try and get, that's important, we will try and get that into as many groups as we can, make sure that people hear that information about the research. We will invite the researchers to present to the groups. And we will generally make sure that information is circulated. And I think that's been really powerful in bringing issues home to decision makers. One, that we are there, they can hear our voices. We're giving them research, which is really important. But I think the other really important role that we can have there is that we bring real life experiences to those groups that both Rodney and I and other community members hear about or experience. And we all know that those real life lived experiences moments are really the things that often impact change. So I think that high level of engagement in those groups has been really pivotal in creating deep and lasting relationships, and means that we can influence. I mean, we don't get all the things we want, and it doesn't always go our way, but we feel like we have channels of communication to bring up issues and to talk about different things that are happening in the community and that matter to the community. Rodney, would you like to say anything else about those groups?
Thanks, Lynn. Maybe just a few words about what we've achieved through those groups. Now, as Lynn said, some of them have been operating for more than a quarter century, and there's a long list of new policies and programs that have been initiated through those groups that there isn't time for me to go through now. But just thinking about some of the recent initiatives that may be useful to talk about. In the Department of Justice, for instance, in that LGBTIQA+ working group, we've been working on a trans prisoner policy in response to the death of a trans woman in a Tasmanian prison, which has been, I mean, it hasn't been released yet, but I understand that it is, it's something which other states are looking at, because it is quite comprehensive and is seen as quite groundbreaking. Another groundbreaking reform that we've seen through these groups is the implementation of the Australian Bureau of Statistics standards for LGBTIQA+ data collection. Tasmania, largely through the work that we've done in these groups, is leading again the nation on that we've got a much wider spread of ABS implementation across the Tasmanian public sector than the other states do, or the Commonwealth. And I understand, again, people from other states and the federal government have been in touch with the Tasmanian public servants to talk about that implementation, how it's going and what the problems are, and how we've been able to do it so quickly and across the board. Another important initiative in the last couple of years was a survey of the LGBTIQA+ community across the state, the largest of its kind, initiated by the government, undertaken by the University of Tasmania, and which is forming the basis for a new framework and action plan for the whole of government, and hopefully as well funding for that action plan. Tasmania Police recently issued a new action plan on LGBTIQA+ inclusion and safety. The Department of Education, Children and Young People, is working on the latest edition of its LGBTIQA+ guidelines and procedures for schools. That I think is the 6th or 7th iteration of that particular policy. because of course it needs to keep up with changing requirements and changing needs in Tasmania schools. In terms of health, a really important outcome recently was the government funding, working it out to do a scoping exercise on a mental health, LGBTIQA plus mental health service in Tasmania, a dedicated mental health service, which we desperately need. And I'm cautiously hopeful that we'll see progress on that in the next couple of years, regardless of the outcome of the Tasmanian election in a few weeks. Oh, and of course, I shouldn't forget the addition of a letter to the acronym. The Tasmanian government, again, through the work of the reference groups that Lynn's mentioned, added asexual, agender and aromantic people through the letter A to the LGBTIQA plus acronym. Tasmania was the first state in Australia to do that. Victoria, I think, has followed since. But again, you know, in all of these areas, it's wonderful that Tasmania is showing leadership, from the ABS implementation through to recognising asexual, agender and aromantic people officially at a state government level. Is there anything I've forgotten there, Lynn, that we should alert people to?
No, maybe the only one, I think, Rodney, is it's also the long-term, I know it's a bit of a sensitive topic at the moment, but the long-term Tasmanian training that's happened with all Tasmanian police recruits from a date that you can tell me and I don't know, but it has been a long time now and that's been significant.
Yeah, since 1990, police recruits have undertaken LGBTIQA plus training. There have also been examples of on-the-job training for police in Tasmania as well, particularly in trans issues. And a recent survey of police and the LGBTIQA plus community initiated by the police service to determine what still needs to be done, found that there had been significant changes. There have been significant changes in attitudes in the police and practices, and growing trust within our community of the police. And that's, again, not to say that things are perfect, not at all, but there is empirical evidence there to show that things have improved. Talking about empirical evidence, it might be worth just mentioning, as well as the policy initiatives that we've seen recently, some of the research that we've seen as well, and the role that plays. Lynn, you mentioned that we present research to these reference groups. And we also make an effort to ensure that we have Tasmania-specific research in many of the key areas that we're talking about. I mentioned that policing research, which was commissioned by the police and conducted by the University of Tasmania. And I mentioned the research that the state government commissioned. That will be the basis of the statewide action plan. Equality Tasmania last year released research into trans and gender diverse access to affirming healthcare in Tasmania, showing that there were unconscionable delays in that and more resources are needed to reduce delays and increase awareness, particularly of the needs of non-binary people. Equality Tasmania now is working on research in relation to asexual, agender and aromantic people in terms of the discrimination they experience. Hopefully that'll be out later in the year. And then there's the Tasmania Project, which is a whole of population survey that disaggregates LGBTIQA plus people. That's conducted by the university as well. And it has found higher levels of housing risk and other socioeconomic risk that LGBTIQA plus people face, largely because of the discrimination and stigma that we still experience. So we have high levels of housing risk, lower levels of income, lower levels of education, and all those factors, which obviously that's awful, and that we try our best to fit that into government policy to help that shape government policy. But it's important that we know it's there, that we know it is there, and that we have empirical research to show that that socioeconomic disadvantage is there. Because too often people think of the disadvantage we face is entirely in terms of, discrimination at work or at school or poor mental health outcomes. It's less often that people think about the wider socioeconomic impacts of that discrimination.
And Rodney, if I can add to that, I mean, I think through our engagements, through the work for yourself and Equality Tasmania has done in the legislative space and advocacy there, and through the community involvement in the reference groups and working groups that we have in the various departments. I mean, it does mean that we can have a fairly high profile in government. And one of the unique, I think, achievements of the last 12 months or so as well is that because particularly Equality Tasmania, which is Rodney, and Working It Out, which is myself, collectively, we provided a lot of support for the reference groups and chairing and all sorts of staff to attend. And we were doing a lot of research for the government. We were providing policy advice, whether it's on the schools guidelines or the transgender policy for prisons or police training. We were providing all of this sort of advice for not exactly for free, but well, in Equality Tasmania's case, for free. Working It Out is a funded organisation, but we were putting in far more than we were funded for, basically because we know that if we weren't doing that, there would be a big gap there. But as a result of that, we were able to advocate for funding directly to Working It Out and Equality Tasmania. So we split the funding to provide policy and research advice to the government. So that is specific funding. And so we're not a peak body, and neither of us want to be a peak body, but we were able to make this argument that we do all this work for free, you should pay us for it. And so we're still able to give that frank and fearless advice to government, but also be resourced to do that, which I think is an amazing achievement. And I think recognition of the role that both our organisations have been able to play in this space in Tasmania.
It's not only welcome to have funding to do that work, but over and above that, it's a kind of recognition that the work that we have done through these reference groups in particular, and the policy development that we've achieved and everything else we've talked about, that the government values that it wants it to continue, and that it can see that working with us is a positive thing. And what's particularly valuable about that, I guess, is that, as most people would be aware, Tasmania has a Liberal government. So we're optimistic that regardless of the outcome of the election in a few weeks, that valuing of what we do will continue. There seems to be bipartisan support for the kind of liaison with the queer community that's developed in Tasmania.
Thank you, Rodney, and thank you, Lynn. Just a reminder that we have an opportunity for some Q&A now. So if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A chat and I will pass them on to Rodney and Lynn. I'd like to start though with my own question for you, if I could. I must admit, when I was much younger, I never expected that I would be putting a spotlight onto Tasmania and focusing on how much has been achieved. I'm particularly interested in hearing your reflections on what you think created that. What's the social, political, cultural, environmental factors that's actually enabled Tasmania to leapfrog in the way that it has?
I think there's a couple of things to consider here. Firstly, Tasmania is, like a lot of island societies, very highly interconnected. And back in before decriminalisation, that had a negative effect of many LGBTIQA plus people felt deeply excluded, and many, as a result, would move to Sydney or Melbourne, and Tasmania did have a very negative reputation. But we made a big effort during the 90s and continued to into the 2000s with marriage equality to tell our personal stories across the state to those who would listen, to community groups, service clubs, sporting clubs, school groups, political party branches, whoever it was. And in a small and tightly interconnected place like Tasmania, that has a big impact. So I think that in terms of the change in attitudes that we've seen, and also, which has been quite dramatic, and the laws on top of that, it's been because of the interconnection in Tasmania, and that going out and making an effort to talk to people, to reach out to them, to explain to them why these reforms are necessary, can have a disproportionately beneficial impact. The other point to make is that a lot of the work that we've done has very consciously been about place. So we've located our struggles here in this particular island society, rather than seeing ourselves as sort of a derivative of someone else's struggle from another place. Having that sense of place and having a local narrative about change and how positive it's been, giving people a sense of pride in the changes that have occurred, not just queer people, but everyone. Locating our struggles in this society, I think, has been a very positive element as well. And in terms of just two final points, consistency is important. So we've consistently worked at law reform and policy reform and liaison with government and community attitude change without much let up for you've heard the numbers already, 27 years, 30 years, whatever it is. So that consistency is important. And having non-LGBTIQA plus leaders who are our champions, because they feel part of that narrative I mentioned before, that local narrative. I can think of the current Premier, Jeremy Rockliff, talks about his support for the LGBTIQA plus community coming from being a Lifeline counsellor in the 1990s and getting these calls in northwest Tasmania in particular from desperate and LGBTIQA plus people who were under attack because of the hideous anti-gay rallies that were happening and all the terrible attitudes. We had a police commissioner who had a similar narrative about seeing the hate when he was a young constable in the 1990s and being determined to do whatever he could to stop that when he became, as he did, the police commissioner. So having people who aren't queer but who are part of that narrative of change has been really, really important, because they have a sense of purpose and they feel that they are part of that change, not because they're LGBTIQA plus, but because they're Tasmanians.
Thanks, Rodney. Lynn, did you have some reflections on that as well?
Look, I think Rodney's been here for the long haul, and I'm much more of a newcomer, but I can certainly see the impact of that long-term engagement and relationship building and, that investment by key decision makers, people with influence into the community, which is genuine and real, and you can feel it. It's not just, opportunistic or time limited. So I think that really speaks a lot to what's been able to be achieved. I mean, generally, community attitudes have changed, and Tasmania's certainly come along. I mean, we have a reputation, often I think quite unfairly, of being not a very progressive state, when in fact we are often quite progressive. But, Working Out does a lot of training and capacity building. And once upon a time, we were probably, our focus was on changing hearts and minds and getting people on side. And now we find, of course, there's always a pocket of people who are not going to, agree with you. But generally speaking, when we do our training in a broad range of environments, we see people whose hearts and minds are in the right place. Now they're wanting to know, well, what do they actually do? How do they action that intent? So I think that's been a big shift as well over that. So that's a cultural shift, I think, that's happened widely, but, also particularly here in Tasmania, as Rodney has said, because we probably came the furthest in that respect.
Thanks, Lynn. Can I ask you about the future now? And Lynn, I'd perhaps like to start with you. What do you see are the challenges for the future? What do you see as the next big steps, the things that need to be done, particularly for LGBTIQ plus health and wellbeing?
Yeah, thanks, James. Look, I think historically we know that when reform happens, there is often a backlash. I think Rodney talked about the other day the rubber band effect. You stretch it so far and it pings and it goes back the other way. So I think generally Tasmania is not immune to that impact that we're seeing, like in places like the US now and in pockets of the US, where reform has been significant and quite quick, and now we're seeing people sort of arc up about some of that reform and push back. So the anti-trans actors, anti-LGBTIQ plus actors are out there and have a close relationship with conservative political leaders in particular and community leaders. And so, and are now making some other alliances, such as, with the sort of more hardcore left-wing feminists and even the neo-Nazis. So those alliances are being built. And so I think they represent a real threat everywhere. And here in Tasmania, we have an election coming up. We've been lucky to date to have either a supportive Labor government over the last 20, 25 years or a progressive Liberal government. But there are a number of conservative members of the Tasmanian Liberal Party, including Erica Betts, who are trying to sort of get back in and influence things. And we could see a real change there if those leaders gained ascendancy in the political party, and so we would probably, see some of this progress come to a halt. Notwithstanding the fact that we have seen progress continue because of the departmental reference groups, but I guess if that weight of that political opposition was too high, we would probably that some of that reform would slow down. Yeah, and look, of course, the other big sort of challenge is also, look, it is a bit of a progression, a bit of a ladder. So once upon a time, for example, we were never considered in policy. We weren't deserving of policy consideration or funding consideration. We were just kind of over there. And gradually, we as I know, James, that gradually we've made our way into policies and frameworks, and now into sort of priority group listings. And the challenge is and that happens at the state level as well. But the challenge is now to get the funding and the resources to action things rather than just talking about it. So we still find generally we're in there, we're in the documents, we're in the housing policy, we're in the mental health policy and all these things, but sometimes the funding to do what's needed. And because we're pretty far behind in some of those areas, there's a lot of gaps to make up, and that can seem sometimes a bit overwhelming to funders. But, working it out in particular has had great success over the last few years, advocating to government. We've got some substantial funding to back up our work in schools for the next 3 years at least. We have the Better Lives Intersex project, which is a national first, being supported by the Tasmanian Community Fund. We've had funding to extend really our service further around the state. So there's been some big wins there, but I think, I don't think either Rodney or I feel a sense of that it's all tickety-boo and that, things will just tick on from here. I think there's a real sense that we need to keep our profile high in this space. We need to keep engaging with the people that make decisions.
Lynn, I think you've accidentally hit mute.
Yes, I did, sorry. Moving my pages. And keep reminding people that there's a lot of need in the community and that those needs need to be addressed.
Thanks, Lynn. At this point, we don't have any questions from participants, but we're almost near time. Rodney, I wondered if you wanted to have any final reflections about the future. I'm not at all surprised to hear Lynn use the rubber band metaphor, and I've heard you talk in the past about a cyclical metaphor and things going round in circles. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about the future and where we're at the moment.
The rubber band metaphor was something that I used to use to describe how Tasmania had gone from worst to best. because those who were against decriminalisation pulled the rubber band all the way in one direction with their hatred, and then it bounced, with decriminalisation, it bounced back, and we saw these progressive laws and policies and attitudes. But the point here, of course, is that that can work against us as well as for us. I remember an American journalist saying to me that it was like Tasmania had gone from being Alabama to being Vermont. Right now, we face the real threat of going from being Vermont to being Florida. With not much of a change of the personnel in Parliament, we could find people pushing anti-trans legislation, banning books, a wind back of the Anti-Discrimination Act. That was something that was attempted by the federal government under the Religious Discrimination Bill. They directly targeted the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Act. And there were certainly people who want to roll back our protections there. So in the name of religious freedom. So yeah, there are serious threats, and I'd agree with Lynn that the best way to deal with them is to keep on moving forward. We can't rest for a moment on our laurels, and we certainly can't think that what we've achieved is enough. We need to keep pushing for the reforms and also the funding, like Lynn said, that will ensure that our community has the same kind of outcomes as everyone else, which is not the case at the moment. Yeah, so we're alert to the dangers and are doing our best to make sure that the wheel, if it turns against us, will then turn back in favour of equality and inclusion. It certainly felt to me during the debate on the Religious Discrimination Bill that there was a wheel that had turned, and after marriage equality, I thought we were way up here, but then we got turned, the wheel turned and we were plunged down into the mud. I still believe in progress, but I realise now that it takes a lot longer than often we realise. We need to keep pushing with our shoulders on that wheel to move it forward so that the gains that we've made aren't rolled back.
Thank you, Rodney. I appreciate it. And I think given the enormous progress Tasmania's made, and I've certainly appreciated hearing you talk about how that's been achieved and what's been happening. And so I think I'd like to keep that focus at the end of our webinar today on how much has been achieved, at the risk of the images of wheels and rubber bands and bounce backs and turning on, and the optimism that we'll continue to bounce back. So just a final special thank you, Rodney, Croome and Lynn Jarvis, for your time this afternoon and for sharing your experience. For everyone else, thank you for being here. Just a reminder that our next webinar is in 2 weeks' time and focused on co-design and how we can use that in planning our projects and our work. So I look forward to seeing you again there. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.